Scientists didn't figure out when humans started wearing clothes by finding clothes. They figured it out by studying lice. That sentence alone should stop you, because it sounds impossible. Clothing rots. It disappears within decades, let alone tens of thousands of years. There should be no way to know when the first human being pulled an animal hide over their body for the first time. And yet researchers found the answer anyway, hiding inside one of the most disgusting parts of your body's history. Here's how. There are two kinds of lice that live on humans: head lice, which cling to hair, and body lice, which live in clothing and only make brief contact with skin to feed. Body lice cannot survive without fabric. No clothing, no body lice. It's that simple. Which means somewhere in the genetic code of body lice is a hidden timestamp, marking the exact moment humans started wearing something these insects could colonize. Geneticist Mark Stoneking led research comparing the DNA of human head lice and body lice to calculate when the two diverged into separate lineages. His findings pointed to roughly 170,000 years ago, give or take tens of thousands of years, as the moment body lice split off to exploit a brand new habitat that hadn't existed before. Clothing. Sit with that number for a second. 170,000 years ago. That's not a small span of prehistory. That's tens of thousands of years before humans built the first permanent shelters, before agriculture, before anything resembling a settlement. Your ancestors were wearing something on their bodies while still living as small, mobile groups, long before almost anything else we associate with early human innovation. Think about how strange this method actually is as a piece of science. Nobody dug up a hide jacket and carbon dated it. There was nothing physical to find, because organic material like leather and fur breaks down almost completely within a few thousand years under normal conditions, let alone 170 millennia. Instead, researchers worked backward from a completely different question. When did a parasite that depends entirely on clothing first appear as its own distinct species? That required comparing mutation rates between head lice and body lice DNA, essentially using the parasite's own evolutionary clock to reverse engineer a date for an object that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. It's one of the strangest and most elegant pieces of detective work in all of human origins research, built entirely on the genome of an insect most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid. So why then? What was happening 170,000 years ago that suddenly made clothing necessary? The answer isn't fashion. It isn't modesty. It's ice. Roughly this same period overlaps with a series of brutal glacial cycles, when large parts of the planet plunged into extreme cold. Humans at this point were still anatomically built for a warm African climate, hairless compared to other primates, with bodies designed to shed heat efficiently rather than retain it. That's a serious problem when the temperature drops far below what bare skin can tolerate. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan, who has spent years studying the origins of clothing through indirect evidence like tool marks and climate data, argues that clothing wasn't a single invention, but a response that intensified and reappeared multiple times, tightly linked to cold snaps throughout the Ice Age. In warmer stretches, clothing use appears to have relaxed. In brutal cold periods, the evidence for more sophisticated coverings sharpens. Clothing, in other words, wasn't a creative choice. It was climate technology, invented and reinvented as the planet demanded it. Think about what that actually means for the people living through it. A human body loses heat fast without insulation. In freezing temperatures, hypothermia can set in within hours, sometimes less. Without clothing, entire populations would have been locked out of huge portions of the planet, unable to survive anywhere the temperature dropped too low for too long. Clothing wasn't decoration, it was the technology that unlocked the rest of the map. And this connects to something much bigger than staying warm. Clothing may be one of the primary reasons humans were able to leave Africa at all. For most of early human history, our ancestors stayed within warmer latitudes, for the obvious reason that their bodies weren't built to survive anywhere else. But once effective clothing existed, that boundary broke. Populations could push into colder regions, follow migrating animals into harsher climates, and eventually spread across nearly the entire planet, something that would have been biologically impossible without a way to simulate the thick fur other cold-adapted animals were born with. This is where the story gets a second twist, Because clothing wasn't invented once and left alone. It evolved. For a long stretch of prehistory, early clothing likely amounted to little more than draped hides, wrapped and tied, offering warmth but with obvious gaps and limitations. Then, around 40,000 years ago, something changed. Eyed sewing needles start appearing in the archaeological record, carved from bone and ivory, fine enough to pass thread through fabric rather than simply wrap it around a body. Archaeologist Olga Soffer, who studied impressions of woven material preserved accidentally in fired clay at Upper Paleolithic sites, found evidence of surprisingly sophisticated textile production, twisted fibers, woven patterns, technology far more advanced than simple draped hides. This wasn't survival gear thrown together out of desperation anymore. This was engineering. Fitted clothing that sealed out wind and cold far more effectively than anything worn before it. And this technological leap lines up almost exactly with a major shift in where humans were able to live. Around this same period, populations pushed deep into Siberia and other extreme cold environments that would have been lethal without tightly fitted, well-insulated clothing. The needle, small enough to lose in a pocket today, may be one of the most consequential tools your ancestors ever invented because it's the tool that let them survive winters no other primate could endure. This regional variation shows up clearly in the archaeological record once you know where to look. Sites in colder northern latitudes tend to yield far more evidence of specialized tools associated with hide processing, scrapers, awls, and eventually needles, while sites in warmer regions show comparatively little. This isn't a coincidence. It's a direct map of necessity. Populations pushing into colder territory had no choice but to develop better clothing technology or lose the ability to survive there at all, while populations in milder climates could get by with far less investment in fitted garments. Clothing sophistication, in other words, tracked almost perfectly with how hostile the local environment was, evolving fastest exactly where the stakes were highest. There's an uncomfortable comparison buried in all of this. Neanderthals lived through many of these same brutal cold periods, in many of the same regions, for far longer than modern humans had at the time. And yet, the archaeological evidence for sophisticated sewn clothing among Neanderthals is far thinner. Some researchers have proposed this gap in clothing technology may have played a role in why Neanderthal populations struggled more severely as climates shifted and modern humans expanded into shared territory. It's a controversial idea and far from settled, but it points to something worth sitting with. A difference as small as draped hide versus fitted, sewn clothing may have been the margin between a population that thrived through an ice age and one that didn't survive it. There's also a social dimension to this that rarely gets mentioned. Producing fitted, sewn clothing wasn't a one-person task you could knock out in an afternoon. Preparing a hide alone, scraping away fat and tissue, softening it through repeated working, sometimes smoking it to prevent rot, took real time and skill. Add sewing with bone needles and sinew thread on top of that, and you're looking at a process that likely required cooperation, specialization, and knowledge passed carefully from one person to another. Some researchers studying the social structure of Upper Paleolithic groups have suggested that clothing production may have been one of the earliest examples of skilled, specialized labor within human communities, a task certain individuals became particularly good at and were relied upon to perform for the group. If that's accurate, the jacket keeping you warm today has ancestry not just in survival necessity, but in some of the earliest divisions of labor your species ever organized. Which brings this back to something deeply strange about your own life. You get dressed every single morning without a second thought. It's automatic, boring, barely a decision at all. But that simple act, pulling fabric over your body before walking outside, is a direct continuation of one of the most consequential survival technologies your species ever developed. It's the reason your ancestors could chase herds into frozen valleys, cross land bridges into brutal Arctic conditions, and eventually populate nearly every corner of a planet that would have killed them within hours without it. And this technology didn't just protect against death. It reshaped what a day could look like. Without adequate clothing, cold weather forces the body to spend enormous amounts of energy simply maintaining core temperature, energy that could otherwise go toward hunting, traveling, or caring for children. Effective clothing freed up that energy budget entirely. A well-insulated body could travel farther, hunt longer, and survive exposure that would have been fatal to an earlier, more exposed ancestor. In a very real sense, clothing didn't just keep people alive through winter. It expanded what was physically possible during it, turning entire seasons that once forced near total dormancy into windows where hunting, migration, and daily survival tasks could continue almost uninterrupted. You don't think about lice when you get dressed. You definitely don't think about ice ages or bone needles or the specific moment your ancestors crossed a threshold that let them survive a world their bodies were never built for. But every time you put on a jacket without a second thought, you're using a piece of technology so old, so foundational, that scientists had to study insects just to figure out when it began. The next time you get dressed on a cold morning, remember what you're actually doing. You're repeating the exact solution that let a hairless, warm-climate primate survive an ice age, spread across an entire planet, and outlast 170,000 years of winters that should have ended the story a long time before it reached you.